Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. In this interview, we'll uncover insights into the complexities and aspirations of governance in Africa's diverse nations. Today, we are eager to explore authentic perspectives on African governance, delving into the insights of local people, scholars, and leaders. Let's warmly welcome our special guest today, Dr. Gilbert A. Hello.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm glad to be here.
Dr. Gilbert A. is a researcher and practitioner in leadership and governance, focusing on Africa. He is the CEO of Accent Leadership Group and the Executive Director of Accent Global Initiative, a think tank that advocates for good governance and policy innovation. He is also a Policy Leader Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, and additionally, he also serves as a Chair of Learning Facilitation for Rotary International District 9212 and is an adjunct lecturer for strategic leadership and management at the ACT University in Rwanda, Kigali. So Dr. Gilbert A. is very qualified to speak about African governments, but also his life, his philosophy of living, his vision for good governance brings additional value to this discussion. Let's start with the first question, and let's start with basic. How do you define good governance in African context, and how does this differ from, let's say, conventional liberal democratic models?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Martin, once again. And that's a very controversial question, especially when you say good governance and how it's been defined over the years in many other facets. What I'll say is, if you look at from an African perspective, especially looking at the post-colonial, post-independence discussions, and a lot of global institutions were striving to support Africa in one or another in building up some structures. So a lot of good governance definitions were actually coming from the likes of World Bank, who are coming in and say, okay, this is what needs to be defined as good governance. But that over the years has transformed and changed in many ways. I like the definition that was published in an article by Orumwesi and Uganda in 2012. That also was somehow adopted by African Union when they were developing the Africa AU Agenda 2063, that talks about good governance as facets of accountability, transparency, responsiveness, equitable and inclusivity, issues around efficiency and effectiveness, following the rule of law, participatory and consensus oriented. So that was then the framework through which African Union somehow developed the discussions around good governance in Africa, and it developed the Agenda 2063. But I like to summarize that into three areas for me, because I see when we talk about consensus, participatory and equitable and inclusiveness, we are talking about collaboration here. Because without collaboration, then there is no good governance that we're talking about. Then issues around following the rule of law, being accountable and transparent, I classify that as accountability. And then now the effectiveness and efficiency and responsiveness, I classify that as, autonomous, especially looking at the different institutions that we have within Africa. So then for me is good governance is about collaboration. Good governance is about having autonomous institutions that are, checking one another, but also interdependent. But also good governance is about being accountable in many spaces that we find ourselves in, especially from the different government institutions. Looking at that into, if you look at, and like now, some of the models that were brought in, that were more, shifting out from the indigenous values of Africa. So you find that they were more donor-driven. World Bank is coming, IMF is coming and say, look, these are the things that I want. This is how good governance looks like. So then you end up, having one facet of values from a good governance, and then exploiting it as, the good governance agenda. So I think the liberal models were more donor-driven, and they were more selfish in terms of driving specific agendas, as compared now to what we're looking at and possibly what the African Union is trying to drive from a broader perspective, in looking at various areas now from an Africa-wide discussion.
And how is the vision of good governance accepted or received by various African nations and states? Because this is sort of common misperception that we see Africa as Africa, but Africa means many states and its diversity of people, cultures, and everything. So how would you comment on that?
I think one of the things that is critical, especially in understanding Africa, is if you look at their government structures across the different African countries, there is some level of similarity, especially when you're looking at the government composition. And this is also the same maybe in other countries across the world. So we have the presidency, we have the legislature, and we have the judiciary. If you look at some of the issues that are happening in various other countries within Africa, they are more or less the same. We have issues around authoritarian, presidency, and it trickles down to also authoritarian leaders in different institutions. We have issues around unemployment. We have issues around corruption. We have issues around youth unrest. So all these are similar across African countries, and that's why when you're talking about agenda for Africa, it's because of the similarity of the issues across different countries. Look at what is happening in a few West African countries. It's also happening in a few of the East African countries in terms of militarization a bit, and some of the conflicts and wars that are there. So it also cuts across the northern part of Africa. So all these are similar issues that can be addressed somehow if we're able to have a concerted effort in showcasing in our various African countries that this can be done. Then that can be replicated across other African countries.
Right. I know that you wrote a good article that I will include in the YouTube description, and you elaborated on the intra-government collaboration. Can you please briefly describe your ideas, maybe your thoughts coming out of this article? Because I think this is sort of underexplored dimension of good governance in Africa. And also some people might wonder, what does exactly mean intra-government collaboration in Africa, and how can we imagine that in practical life?
So what I usually like to give as an example is in any country, for example, you find that you have the three arms of government, which are, if you have to say, what is the government of, for example, if I use my country, Kenya, the government of Kenya comprises of the president, the judiciary, or the president who is executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. So this is the government. So when we are talking about who are the people who needs to address issues of youth unemployment, issues of poverty, issues of wars and conflicts, it is the government. So it's not the executive alone. It's not the judiciary alone. It's not the legislature. So all these are part of them. So what I say is there is a lot of, from a framework perspective that is in most constitutional frameworks in African countries, there is an understanding that they need to work together. But are they really working together? You see, in many countries, you find that there is conflict between the judiciary and the executive. And in some countries, you find that there is what we call state capture, where the executive has actually taken over the legislature and sometimes taken over the judiciary. So the question that I try to answer, especially when I'm addressing the aspect of intra-government, is if you look at the three arms of government, who can stand and say that they have the interest of their country at heart? None of them can. So then that means that they need to be able to work together to address the major issues within their country. So if it's corruption, how can they form a framework where they tackle the aspect of corruption? If it's issues around unemployment, how can they form a collaboration framework, intra-government collaboration framework where they can address those issues? At least some major critical issues that are affecting their country. And that's for me when I talk about intra-government collaboration, that's the focus that I'm focusing on, because they need to understand this is our country, these are the issues. how do we form a framework to address these issues for our country? There has been a lot of intergovernment collaboration in terms of the way the government engages with other external stakeholders, and it's working well, including some of the collaborations with other countries through various trade agreements like the East Africa Commission, the West, the SADC, and many other ways. The Africa Continental Free Trade engagements. So those are intergovernment collaborations which are working at least to some level. They need some more work. But what is creating issues that are resulting into some of the conflicts, the wars that we are seeing in Africa, it's actually internally. If they're able to resolve that, then they're able to, tackle some of the explosive issues that are affecting different countries.
And do we have any examples of more successful and less successful countries in implementing that intra-governmental collaboration?
I think it's a new thing now, and it's a new discussion that some of us are now propagating. We see some elements of it, like if you look at, for example, in Rwanda, you can see some form of intra-government engagements and forums where then they are focused on addressing the national issues together. Somehow that has also, somehow gotten some traction maybe in South Africa or maybe in Kenya a few times. But then in the course of depending on the political cycles and the new executive that is coming on board, we find that then there is some aspect of split because of political tensions and so on. So I think this is something that needs to be built as a national framework for countries, so that regardless of the political cycles, then this framework of the three arms of government working together to address the national issues remains into place, and it's not really, affected by the political cycles that are there every 5 years or every 4 years.
The next question it's slightly more difficult to answer because of the diversity of African nations and countries, but can we underline some main institutional or political obstacles that are preventing that effective intra-government collaboration? And maybe based on your research, you can say a few words. Why is it happening? And is there any positive or negative prospect for the future?
I think there is some positive, if I can maybe look at it broadly into the future. One is because also now the Africa Union, from an agenda perspective, they are really trying to create, develop pressure into the different African countries to somehow, operate within the framework of good governance that we've just talked about. So somehow there's a bit of work around it, but in reality is today, and then we see it even globally, is we are seeing the rise of populist leaders, and that's not unique to Africa, where then leaders are coming in with populist agenda, but when they come in, then they really then become more of authoritarians. And that's why we see tensions in different countries and so on. I mean, recently, if you look at for example, in East Africa, we've had some incidences of abductions of youth and activists and so on. So you can see that these are things that are really derailing then the progress on good governance that, that the Africa Union is striving to drive. So there's an aspect of executive overreach that sometimes then creates a barrier in terms of the good progress that we're making, then we make another few steps back. Then we also have this weak institutional independence. That's the core aspect of intra-government collaboration. Because if we have weak legislature and we have weak judiciary that are more or less funded politically by the executive, then definitely from an engagement perspective, they are coming already from a point of weakness. So we need to be able to create structures, and that's where the intra-government framework comes in, to create structures that then give more or less equal opportunities to these institutions to come in and drive a focused agenda for the country. Then we know in many countries, and of course African countries is not excluded. We have this patronism, that this is my people. This person comes from, especially in Africa, you find that there is more tribal alignment. So this person comes from my tribe, and we need to vote them in. So that then creates issues that when people are voted in based on tribal affiliations, and when they come in, then they need to align with their tribal affiliations to ensure that they survive their political journey. And of course, then this then results into fragmented policies and frameworks that then creates constraints around driving the same agenda that we're looking at in terms of collaboration, in terms of autonomy, and in terms of accountability. So these are some of the things that are hindering good progress that is being made. But when there is a new political cycle, then we come and start afresh in the whole discussions around good governance progress, especially from an intra-government collaboration.
There are two follow-up questions. The first one, you mentioned weak institutions or sort of structures. Yeah. How does that work in practice, and what is that weakness? Like why we can say weak? So what is causing that weakness? And the second question, you mentioned also African Union. Can you say a few words how African Union is either supporting or not supporting that notion of good governance in Africa?
Okay, so first I'll start with the second question we're talking about Africa. So from Agenda 2063, from an African Union perspective, there are 10 aspirations or 10 aspirations that have various goals around it. But one of the overarching goals is when we have good governance across Africa, African countries, where we have leaders who are following the rule of law. Leaders who are, driving democracy through participation of, citizens and civic engagement, leaders who are accountable to the people, leaders who are transparent and responsive, and there is an aspect of equitable and inclusiveness in various other engagements. Then somehow a number of structural and developmental agendas in different countries will progress. And that's a main drive, especially for African Union, in terms of creating stability within the region, and then unity of purpose in addressing some of the concerns that different countries have. So that's how they are driving. And of course, there are various initiatives that are focused on ensuring that they support country by country, especially those that have related issues around it. But when you're looking at it now, from individual countries. Of course, individual countries are autonomous, they're independent. So regardless of the agenda that is being driven, there has to be some political acceptance within the countries. And that's where you find there is some issues, especially when you have, for example, in a season where you have an executive who is pro-development, pro-good governance, and then now the next cycle of the next political cycle, then you have leaders and executives who are coming in that are not that are more driven by selfish interest, and then the aspect of authoritarianism that comes into place. So first they come in with the agenda of the people, but then now once they empower, then that shifts. So then in terms of relationship, especially in terms of looking at what African Union is championing across Africa, then you find that there's some rift around it, and we see it in many countries in Africa. As a result of change of political cycle, then we have institutions, sometimes either they can be strengthened or they can be weakened as a result of, depending on the executive leader, because we've given so much power to the executive and, a little bit of weak power to the different institutions. Therefore, for me, when I talk about intra-government collaboration, is for us then to strengthen these institutions in a way that can provide, yes, the checks, but also most importantly is to work together to address the agenda, the national agenda for their country.
Yeah. And in terms of the style of the governance, do you support more decentralization or do you support more a central sort of hub of power? Because this is something that we also have in the European Union. You have the supranational level, which is directed by the Brussels, and then you have member states, which is more local, decentralized political power. So how do you see this process in Africa? And what are your expectations for the next years, where African states might align more decentralized, or they will be more centralized by the power?
I think where we are seeing the trend, especially globally, is we are seeing a trend of centralization, and this is the worrying trend. But of course, what Africa Union is driving, and what most of the Africa citizens and even the youth you see are driving through the many advocacy and activism that you see with the youth in Africa, is they're driving a more collaborative government that is decentralized, that then are able to address the specific needs of them, especially for Africa, because the development needs for Africa is different from the development needs of other developed nations. So there's a lot of decentralization that needs to happen in African countries, so that then the basic developments within the rural areas can actually be driven positively. And we've seen that in countries like Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, where then when you have decentralized, and even Egypt, when you have decentralized resources and governance into the different regions across their countries, and you see some development coming up, and some of the basic amenities that have been lacking in those rural areas are being addressed by the leaders at the grassroots level. So for Africa, for me, I will say there is need to push for more decentralization, so that then we avoid the drive towards authoritarianism and, of course, centralized resource management, which has been the issue for the longest time in Africa in terms of development progress.
Which elements are the most difficult to decentralize? Which I think it's a difficult question, I know, but still, based on your research, maybe you can have some sort of visions or incentives or some thoughts to share with us.
Yeah. So let me look at some of the major issues. Like we have education, we have health, we have issues around government services, especially in terms of administrative functions of services. We have issues around housing and affordable. Not necessarily affordable, but decent housing. We have issues around water and sanitation. So if I look at some of the major issues that are affecting Africa, I don't think there's none that can be decentralized. Cannot be decentralized, because we've seen examples in most of the countries. Look at what is happening, for example, in Senegal, in Rwanda, in Morocco. These things are decentralized. Even in Kenya, we see the services have been decentralized. The government has actually decentralized the services. But the reason why you find that some services are still being centralized is because of, especially the services that involve financial gain, so that then people are able to control the financial spending. So issues like treasury, and of course the budgeting aspect will still continue to remain at central government level, for selfish reasons also, because I feel these are also things that can be resolved in the different region, like we see in other developed countries. But of course, because of selfish reasons and in ways to protect some of the activities around corruption and so on that happen in many African countries, that's why you find some of those things are still being held from a central level perspective. But if they can be decentralized, where now the different treasuries work with the central treasury to ensure that equitable distribution of financial resources that then will drive development in the grassroots, then we can see a change, especially in development in many African countries, because then external partners will come in and engage with the grassroots leaders in the development needs of the different rural areas and support in terms of that drive. But right now, it's a little bit difficult. It's difficult to have, for example, a public-private partnerships that are more beneficial and driven at local level. There has to be some element of it being driven at the central level, and this is where now it creates corruption issues, because then, a few people would want to have what is the need for them, even as they disseminate down to the local areas.
Absolutely. I think it's also a difficult issue in European Union as well, but maybe we have a different perspective, but the root or the core of the problem remains very similar. Let's go to another question. Again, slightly more difficult. In your view, does intra-government collaboration function more effectively as a mediator or a moderator of governance outcomes?
So that's more scientific and academic. But the essence around, the essence around mediator and moderator, if I can put it in a simpler term, is a mediator works if, for example, if I look at, the things that needs to be in place at what I call the antecedents of good governance, like issues around the structural issues, institutional reforms that needs to be in place in advance, issues around citizen participation. When you talk about the cultural issues, like, cultural orientations of our various countries, and of course, ensuring that our people are political conscious, and systemic things as antecedents. Like, these are now things like democracy and democratic institutions that needs to be in place. And of course, issues of anti-corruption and structures that we put in place that then strengthens the drive, the push towards eliminating corruption. So these are some of the things that needs to be in place before we talk about good governance. Because then, if they are not in place, then when you talk about intra-government collaboration, then we will not have, and it will not be effective, or it will not see the light of day if that happens. So a mediator then, if I look at intra-government collaboration as a mediator, I look at it as a facilitator of the outcomes of good governance. And the outcome of good governance is we have issues around the right democratic systems. We have stability. We have leaders who follow the rule of law. When I look about it from an economic perspective, I look at sustainable development in different countries, trade openness, and of course, investment attractiveness. The social outcome of good governance is around human development, the youth development that we see, social cohesion, and of course, citizen participation in the process of democratic process. But of course, there is a leadership outcome of good governance, which is we have ethical leaders, we have leaders who are accountable, and leaders who are collaborative. So intra-government collaboration can only be a facilitator from a mediating perspective, if to result into the outcomes that we talk about, if there are antecedents of good governance are in place. But intra-government collaboration can also, drive and champion the formation of the antecedents, or the acceleration of the antecedents. That's where now we call them moderators. They can champion, they can challenge the internal government to now address the structural issues that then will result into some antecedents, some at least basic aspect of good governance that will also be able to accelerate the outcomes that we are looking at from a good governance. So that's when it operates as moderator. So it can be both ways. So for systems, for governments that already have some basic antecedents of good governance in place, it is able to facilitate the outcome very well. For those that do not have, then it challenges the construction of the antecedents that then will drive the outcome that is required.
And that sounds logical, and it has some sense. So the next question follow up basically, when you speak about good governance from your perspective, how is this taught or being spread across Africa, those thoughts? So, for instance, do you see any universal initiatives in Africa? For instance, there is one team of people, and the team of people is going country by country explaining the principles that you just mentioned, for instance, of good governance. Is there such a thing?
Yes. For example, I'll just give an example. Last year in 2024, African Union was driving an agenda of education and bringing the aspect of bridging the aspect of inequality and inclusiveness, especially in the educational system across Africa, which is a fundamental part because if you look at the way some of the African countries are in terms of their development, then there is a lot of inequality in education. So government-funded schools have issues across the different countries in Africa. So then it bridges in some aspect of inequality in education. And yet, if you look at the population, from a population perspective, Africa children today account for 38% of global children population. In the next, by 2050, it is estimated that the children in Africa will account for 50% of the global population of children. So then education is a fundamental piece in terms of bridging the inequality gap and providing platforms where then our children, as they move into adulthood, today we know 70%, over 70% of the youth population is in Africa. So then this is a critical part. This year, I know the theme is about reparation and, of course, trying to bridge in a lot of injustices that have been done over the years. And also now for African countries to really take their place, especially in terms of financial inclusion, issues around, taking their place from a financial gain perspective, so then they're able also to take ownership of their development. So these are discussions that will bridge in, will help African countries also to somehow have a way of having internal engagements on development agenda and so on. So, and I know there are also other smaller initiatives that are being driven internally within Africa that then helps to drive the aspect of rule of law, the aspect of transparency, although these are now the things that are lagging behind. In fact, there was a study that was done, I think, in 2021 by either Good Governance Africa or More Ibrahim Foundation that was tracking some of these issues like inclusive growth in Africa was lagging below 40% score based on their indicators. People-driven development was lagging, which is an aspiration 6 of African Union, was actually lagging 38% score. That means that there's a lot to be done to be able to, develop our young people to become, global leaders and also drive the development agenda within the country. So these are some of the things, initiatives that are being spearheaded through African Union, of course, championed through different African countries to drive the focus and agenda of good governance.
And I just want to add a little remark that African universities are also changing, and we see much, much higher quality outcomes coming from Africa based on local research projects financed by local people or NGOs. And I read some of them. I have to say that the ideas, the thoughts I read about, just amazing. And I wish there was more room in, for instance, European Union to present those outcomes, because I think we can both learn a lot from each other as a people, as a countries and continents. So that's quite useful to know as well. The next question, Gilbert, some people might struggle a little bit because they see Africa as many conflicts. There are many internal conflicts plus terrorism and security issues in all over Africa.
Yeah.
What's the difference between traditional conflict resolution and responsible negotiation as two concepts? Because I think this is not 100% clear, so we have the opportunity to explain that.
Yeah. So I know the concept of responsible negotiation has majorly traditionally been it has more been inclined to humanitarian discussions and agenda where you have these wars and conflicts, and then you have all these mediators from different international organizations come in to bridge in and create some level of engagement that will possibly enable some humanitarian assistance and so on. So that has been the case a lot in the humanitarian space. But also, based on the research that we conducted, there is a lot of negotiations that needs to happen within the government itself, so that then they're able to address the specific needs of their country. So when we have leaders then who are not competent in such engagements in terms of driving responsible negotiation, then that's where you find that we have egos splitting out in different engagements, and people are not able to realign and sit down and look at the bigger picture around their country's needs and national issues. And that's why it's important for the leaders, especially in the three arms of government, to understand how can they be able to drive responsible negotiations using the humanitarian perspectives and minds, in terms of bridging in some engagements that will really ensure that the intended results of development, of addressing national matters and issues are resolved. And so the framework that I share around on my research around responsible negotiation is, from a concept perspective, it includes the aspect of conflict resolution in a way that builds trust. So that then both the different arms of government, they need to understand that they are in this together. So it's not about one or the other who needs to feel more inclined towards specific agendas than the other. Then there is an aspect of the reason why it's important, because then it helps in terms of building in resource management aspect, because the resources of the country are managed by the government, and the government are the three arms of government. So then it helps in terms of pulling in some engagement that will result into effective resource management within the country. Then there's issues around inclusivity, that decisions are made as a result of involving the various views of stakeholders. And of course, even looking at the minority views that might have an implication, rather than only the majority view that is propagated, especially mostly through the democracy aspect alone. So when you see a democracy aspect, say the majority rules. But in a responsible negotiation, it's not about the majority, but it's also about really understanding the different frameworks around it. And then this helps to also bring in the international partnerships and engagements in a way that is responsible. Today, that's not the case. The international support comes in when there is already issues, like what we see in Sudan, for example, South Sudan, what we see in other countries. So you find that international support comes in when issues are already, when they're already massive issues. So what you can do is only now to create an avenue of balance. But if the leaders were able to really understand how to negotiate internally within themselves and find a way forward, then they will not actually, move to a space where then the conflicts move out of hand to require external international support. And that's why it's important for them to really understand this concept of responsible negotiations within a government framework, and how they can be able to engage together to resolve and create solutions that are more locally related.
Gilbert, you mentioned minority. I would like to extend this to traditional tribes in Africa, because when we see borders between the countries, it's either very straight or it's a heritage from the past. And I don't want to go to that history of the past, but I want to see, or I want to hear about present or contemporary perspective of how is the representation of those tribes or minorities in contemporary regimes in Africa. Maybe there are interesting perspectives that you can mention and you can educate us.
Yeah. So So in Africa, as compared to maybe many other countries across the world, there's a lot of, as I said initially, tribal affiliations. And and these tribal affiliations are good, but also in many ways, in many countries, politically, it has created issues. And we saw the issues that happened in, for example, Rwanda some time back when there was those tribal fights. In Kenya, we've had a lot of political violence as a result of tribal alignment. That has happened in Uganda, that has happened in South Africa, and many other spaces that many other countries in Africa. So there is a positive aspect of the tribal affiliations because it brings in the cultural richness of Africa and the diversity around Africa. But also there's a negative aspect, especially when it comes to political cycles and so on. But what is common across all the African countries, especially in terms of tribal affiliation, is traditionally there has been this, indigenous practices of community togetherness. For example, in the southern part of Africa, there is this discussions around Ubuntu. We are because you are, or you are because we are. So it's a community aspect that we need to work together to build together. We are here because you are here because we are all here. So working together. In the eastern part of Africa, we talk about Harambee, which is coming together to do something that is more profound. In the western part, we have what we call Sankofa, which is more or less the same, that drives community development. And in the northern part, there is, I think, the UMA, which is more or less the same agenda in terms of working together. So despite the diverse tribal alignments, there is already a common framework across all African countries that if we tap into it, and that's what drove the forefathers of Africa when they are championing for independence of the different countries. These were the things that were creating unity among them. And if you look at some of the history around Africa, you find that most of the African leaders then were championing unity across Africa. At least there's some element of it that has been realized over the years now, but there's still much more. So, and I think these are positive aspects that we can see correlation across. But also, if we're able to tap into the tribal aspect well, it will bring in our diverse cultural nature, but also ensure that we are united by some of these common beliefs of working together.
The next question, Gilbert, is one of those sensitive ones, and that's the donor expectations, put it in polite English. So on one hand, you have the African government with own model of governance, and then you have some international companies, big corporations coming to Africa, usually to get something that they can resell in global markets. And those companies will usually demand some special regulations, maybe laws, maybe some special arrangements. So how do you see that balance between, let's say, African agency and international corporations regarding the good governments in Africa?
And I think that's as you say, it's quite a controversial discussion even now, and you can see even the recent AU-EU discussions that happened, I think, last week, where the ministers of different countries in Africa and in Europe were coming together. And one of the things that they couldn't agree were those fundamentals around, for example, financials, issues around the operation of various unjustified colonial issues. So all these issues have a lot of traditional, or let's say past beliefs and colonial rule. And I think what you see in most of the African countries now are trying to shift from too much external influence into a space where they want to engage with international investors or developers as partners, not not necessarily as, people who come in to impose the direction of where their country needs to go in various ways, whether it's in financial, whether it's in development. I think the pushback we're seeing in many African countries now is look, address us as partners and don't impose your rules on us. Let's discuss and see what you bring on the table, what we will bring on the table, and see how to address specific agenda. So we see that, and we can see that in West African countries. We see that even in some of the East and North African countries that are pushing back and say, look, we are partners. Both when Africa Union is coming together and championing through the Africa Development Bank to strengthen it, it's so that then Africa Development Bank can have the muscles to support development in Africa on itself, so that as it engages with external partners like World Bank, IMF, and so on, then they engage from a space of partnership and not necessarily from a space of weakness. And that's the space that a lot of now African leaders are standing out and saying, look, we have to draw a line. You saw the other day when in Rwanda, when Belgium and Rwanda cut diplomatic ties. We've seen that in Senegal and France. And we are seeing that in many other African countries coming out, because then they want to be respected as partners and not necessarily as the weaker partner within that relationship.
Yeah, I think that's quite perhaps under-researched topic that I would recommend for researchers and young scholars to look at, because it has a very big impact on the good government in Africa. And more we know, more we can research and more we can comment on those issues. The next big issue in Africa is digitalization, internet, technologies and everything, because this is what we see. I mean, sometimes we are even surprised here in Europe, what can we see in Africa, because it's not presented. It's like on those TikTok videos, this is what is Africa and this is what it's shown to be Africa in different parts. And I know that Africa made tremendous progress in digitalization. So, Gilbert, what's your opinion about that? And where you can see more room to even extend this digitalization so you can have enhance governance and even better access to technology and everything connected to that?
So I think, yesterday we were in a conference and we were discussing this aspect around digitization and youth and all these aspects around false information that are being propagated across, the media. And we had some discussion before with the other colleagues that we are talking about how the children in Africa are already using AI in classroom engagements, doing their homework. Actually, in most of the African countries, especially where there is accessible to internet, you find that almost close to 30% of children are using AI in one way or another. So that tells you the impact of technology within the continent. They only are doing that is limiting such expansive access is access to electricity, and of course this is one of the critical agenda for African Union when they talk about mission 300. So they are looking at within the next 10 or so years that 300 million of Africa settlements and people will have access to electricity. So what that means is then when we have access to electricity in one or another, then you find the digital access then will even be much more. But having access also comes with risk. And that's why we're talking about in terms of, is there a need to develop some, regulations around digital access, especially to different groups of people. The same way, there was a global discussion around, some of the things that needs to be aired in mainstream media and that they need to be clearly indicated in terms of age limits so that then, responsible guardians can be able to guide their children well in access of those information. I think that's the discussion that is happening right now, especially in the access to digital information by children and youth. because there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that is propagated across the digital space, and it's very hard to really analyze and have this is the correct one, this is not right. And we saw that if you look at the protests that have been happening in Africa over the last 3 years, including the one that happened in Kenya in last year, where the youth were coming out and saying they want to reject the finance bill for the country. So these were actually things that were propagated through the media. And there were a lot of other false information that also came through the media that in the long run created chaos for a credible protest for the youth, then resulted into some, infiltration by other, machineries and government also to try and discredit the credibility of the discussion. So it's a big discussion around digital access. I know there are various solutions in terms of limiting or not limiting, or then how then do we ensure that the children and the youth are able to verify information that is right and those that are not correct in the long run. So it's a big discussion for me, I would say, around that.
And do you feel any pressure from the big corporations, like they want to implement this and that in Africa, and the government is, deciding which one to choose? Or do you see also the activities of local companies, African businesses in this digitalization? Because we must admit as academics that digitalization is a big business.
I think where we are going is most of the governments in Africa are actually digitizing their services. Which is positive, because then with the youthful population in Africa, then digitizing government services makes it accessible and easier, especially for the youth to engage in the government. So those are some of the positive around it. But there are also various positive ways on how digital and technology advancement is helping Africa, especially in terms of access to other underserved areas, in terms of facilitation of medical equipment and many other things that are positive. But if we're able to encourage them, and of course in partnership with some of the international organizations, then there can be so much, development and growth, especially in terms of addressing some of the inequalities in various underserved rural areas in Africa. So that's the positive aspect. But also there is the negative aspect that then, which is a global conversation around access and what needs to be accessed, and some of the information that are being propagated through the social media. We know many countries, even in Europe, have limited access to some of the social media sites. In China, we know a lot of social media have been limited. Even in some of the African countries, there is some limitation in terms of access to some of the social media. But is that the solution? Maybe not, because if you limit access to some of the social media avenues, what happens is then you are creating an opportunity for others to come in and sprout up that are maybe more unregulated and so on. So I think it's a way of now the key thing will be creating synergy around the such huge international organizations that are owners of some of these key social engagements and technology, to work together with the government in ensuring that there is proper access to the right information, but also not necessarily regulating it and limiting it to the government needs, but also to ensure that access to some of the information is also, the privacy around the information, the choice on individuals on what to access and so on needs to be placed in a way that then drives the development and right to information across the world. Today is a global village. So limiting information through such technological avenues, I think it's a push that will just create more other underground social platforms and technology platforms to come out that are more unregulated.
And Gilbert, digitalization is always coming, as you say, with many pros and cons, as we can see. And one of that, as we mentioned, is energy, because I know like South Africans, for instance, they have a special application that tells them when the energy will be cut, because that's the system how it is over there. Can you say a few words about the access to electricity for regular people? I'm not speaking about those who have a Starlink satellite in the garden, because those people are okay. But I'm speaking about, for instance, children from villages, people who live regular life without earning too much to afford all those gadgets. So let's take a regular small town in Africa. What's the average access to electricity so people can access those technologies?
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, and that's why it's a major drive, especially from an African Union perspective, is there are over 600 million people in Africa that have no access to electricity or any form of electricity at this particular time. So that means there is a lot of limitation in terms of what is happening across the world. What we are talking about here, they have no access. They don't know what is happening elsewhere in the world. So that's why the mission 300 for A is to try and drive 300 million people to have access to electricity. And of course, that is one aspect. Having access to electricity is one aspect that then will help in terms of then unpacking some of the additional access. Like you have access to electricity doesn't mean that you have access to digital information and so on, but it's an enabler. Because once that is there, then maybe other internal engagements and development can happen, so that then the people can have access to such digital information. And of course, Africa-wide, there is a lot of natural resource that if we tap it correctly, then we can be able to generate clean energy that translates into clean electricity production throughout the year. Like, I mean, where I stay, we have almost 10 months out of 12 months in a year where the sun is scorchy hot. So that means that I don't necessarily need to, if I'm able to install some solar panels and so on, then I can actually have my own access to electricity. So these are some of the avenues that different governments are trying. A lot of local governments have tried as much as possible to, drive electricity across their rural areas, but some countries are still struggling a lot. So that then limits the access to digital information. But as we move to the next 5-10 years or so, that access will even be much more, because even the development of some of the gadgets that we are seeing that are coming up, there are some partners that come in and then install locally developed gadgets that then can tap into the natural energy that then helps in access to such digital avenues within a small home setup. So these are things that will come out, and definitely it will take time. It's not something that will be there maybe in the next 5 years or so, maybe 10 years, 20 years, but that will be progressive, especially looking at the diverse underdeveloped areas in Africa.
The last question for this interview, Gilbert. Which reforms do you think are essential for Africa at the moment? We mentioned electricity, energy areas, so this is sort of essential. But beside that, what can you consider as essential reforms that Africa needs?
Yeah, I think there are quite a number of reforms that Africa needs. And of course, these are already, for some countries, these are already in progress. But in the context of good governance, and there's a policy paper that I wrote together with a professor friend of mine, where we talk about some key recommendations, especially for some of the countries that are lagging behind, to institutionalize joint policy platforms as part of their national policies. Because when we have this, then this creates then, as I said, the antecedents for good governance. When we have things like cross intra-government accountability agreements, then this then helps to understand, okay, these are our national issues within our country. this is the framework on how we need to be able to address them. So who is dropping the ball where and how? So then these agreements helps to ensure that they keep each other accountable to the national issues, addressing the national issues of their country. Of course, there are many other things, but if they are focused in terms of ensuring that they address the national issues of their country, then we see some development progress around it. Then also investing, as we say, in digital platforms. And of course, this then comes in with, the access to electricity. So access to electricity then creates avenues for digital engagement. But also most importantly is for me is to ensure that as we develop access to digital platforms is to train our children, our youth on responsible digital advocacy and activism, so that then we avoid situations where we have, we have our children and youth being driven more from an extremism perspective because of what is happening elsewhere across the world. And then, of course, ensuring that we have, cement this discussion around Africa free trade discussions. I mean, it's been a discussion that will happen for a long time. There's been some good progress, but it's not enough. And one of the easier way is if you now move to different African countries, you still see some restrictions in visa and so on. So those are quick wins that really can help start bridging in the free trade discussions and engagements across different countries in Africa. And then now it will move to other technical areas of collaboration and, support in terms of strengthening institutions like Africa Development Bank, institutions that then drive private PPPs. And we've written an article together also with a friend of mine around how we can have responsible private sector to really drive the public-private partnerships in the development agenda of the various countries. So some of these things will only come into place when we break the foundational aspect and what I said earlier around the antecedents of good governance. And once those are in place, then quick progress can be made towards the others that will drive into the outcome that Africa needs in terms of its sustainability, in terms of its internal development, that can be addressed within itself, and it will have a good space in terms of engagement with, external international partners as partners and not necessarily as inferior to, others.
Gilbert, many thanks for your insightful thoughts, for your research that you shared, your research outcomes with us. It's a fascinating topic to speak about and even more to research it. So I would encourage young researchers, experienced and senior researchers to have a look in Africa. Africa, as I said, we see Africa from many different perspectives, but sometimes we miss real Africa, what's Africa really needs and what is really happening in Africa. So I also wish you that you will visit more YouTube podcasts and generally podcasts to spread the word about Africa, about good governments in Africa. And yes, I would like to encourage you to write articles, to publish, because there is a segment of scholars that's reading your thoughts. And I think that's very important to have that international recognition of the work that you're doing. Gilbert, many thanks again for being on IO Thinker.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you for hosting me here today. I look forward to many other engagements in future. Thank you.
Thank you again.